Here are the basics. You know, what does make a dessert unhealthy? Too many calories, oftentimes associated either with the ingredients or the size of the dessert, right? So we have a couple of things to look at there. You know, what are we putting into our desserts, and then how much are we having? And I always like to point out that we are so out of control with our sense of what a portion size is in this country in so many ways, because we've been supersized for years now. And remember when Super Size Me was a thing, and that was wow, big, and now it's normal, right? So it's just become a part of what we are and what we know when we go to restaurants, because we generally get these large portions. Now that's changing a little bit as the cost of goods and food is going up. I think restaurants are rethinking that a little bit, which could end up being a benefit to us in some ways. So I do think, though, of something like ice cream. When was the last time that you went to an ice cream parlor and got a serving size of ice cream? Do you know what a serving size is? One serving of ice cream. Are you aware?
Half cup.
You got it, Janice. It's a half cup. Have you ever gone to an ice cream parlor and gotten a half cup of ice cream? And if you did, what would you do?
Complain to my friend how little ice cream I got for $2.
What is this all I'm getting? So anyway, that's part of the deal. And ice cream is actually pretty caloric, and it's fatty sugar, so it's two of the worst combinations, I guess. So one of the desserts that's least healthy for us. And
a question for you is difference between gelato and ice cream.
Yeah, so gelato is made with milk. It's actually less fatty than ice cream. It's a healthier option. It still has sugar, but oftentimes gelato gets most of its sugar from fresh fruit too, if it's an Italian gelato that is made in the traditional way. So it can be healthier for you. Read the ingredient label, though, if you're buying it at the grocery store, because it's become one of those things that have been sort of usurped. Oh, that's a good idea. Let's make Italian gelato. And then we make it in our American way and kind of make it unhealthy. So check your label. Yeah. So too much sugar is a problem. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, because that's one of those areas that we want to look at the dietary guidelines for and keep a number in our minds if we're trying to get healthier with our sugar intake as well as our fat intake. So let's take a look at that in a little bit. And then another ingredient that is really in a lot of our cakes and pastries is refined white flour. And when we get too much refined white flour, we're getting an ingredient that, like sugar, has no real nutritional value for us. And also, as a double whammy, is something that spikes our insulin. It's something that hits our system and immediately it's our body's attempt to digest it right away, as opposed to other more complex carbohydrates that are digested much more slowly with a much more even insulin response. So I liken sugar and unrefined or refined, I don't know why I keep saying that, white sugar and refined white flour to a little bit of water on a hot griddle. You know, when you put that little splash on a hot griddle, it just burns and disappears. It's a little bit like taking in sugar, taking in white flour. Our sugar levels just spike up and insulin rushes to the scene. So that's not necessarily a good thing, because then that is what can lead to type 2 diabetes.
Deb, the other day I had a chocolate chip cookie, and the sodium was 9%.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so surprised. I was shocked. So I don't know what made it so. I mean, it was wrapped in paper. You know, it wasn't a fresh one. So I don't know. I never thought of looking at sodium when I'm eating chocolate chip cookies, but
you're eating a cookie. Well, there is a little bit of salt in those, but what percent? It's 9%. So what do you know what that meant in terms of, was that 9% of our daily allowance in your cookie there? You can
I guess so.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
It's just
let's
high.
salt is an important thing. You're right, because here's a number you might want to write down that I don't have on here, because I didn't even really think about that as being a big problem with most desserts either. But if you're looking for a guideline on sodium, you want to consider having less than 2,300 milligrams per day, and that's equal to roughly a teaspoon. Most of the time that happens in comes from processed foods. So if you're watching your processed foods and you're minimizing the sodium in that, you can have a little more freedom with your salt shaker at the table and just season things accordingly. Lots of sometimes you have to know by the recipe. Salt is often really added as a flavor enhancer. So lots of times it's just a very minimal amount. I hate to leave it out. I'd rather leave it out of other things. So you have to use your judgment on that. Now, this is the dietary guidelines. If you have been absorbing all of this information, let me just summarize it briefly for you. We should be looking at getting less than 23 grams of saturated fat per day, both men and women. So when you look at your dessert recipes, look for the per serving amount of saturated fat that you're getting, and then think about what it is that you've eaten through the day and whether you've eaten any other, well, where do we get our saturated fat from? Where does saturated fat come from? Sources, things we eat or drink.
Chicken fat, the animal chicken fat on the chicken, the skin on the chicken.
Okay. And Co, what were you saying?
Just it's basically the same thing. Animal fat is probably the biggest source of saturated fats in our diet.
Yeah, it's animal products in general. So Cassandra, it's more than the skin, it's the meat too. And dark meat on a chicken has more saturated fat than white meat. So it's any meat. And so that's why we always talk about eating lean meats in order to lower our saturated fat content. There are certain things, beef is certain cuts of beef, 80% lean ground beef has more saturated fat than 90% lean ground beef. And dairy is another source of saturated fat. It is an animal product. So if you think through your day, well, what did I eat in the way of meat? What did I eat in the way of dairy throughout the day, including cheese? And then think about what you're doing for dessert. Then you can sort of get an idea. Am I staying under these 23 grams of saturated fat?